Hello, Brain Damaged Philosopher here, and welcome to another very short video. In this video, I want to talk about the theist argument that goes, basically, well, there's no evidence against God. This is quite a desperate argument, and obviously it's not very convincing, but I think it's useful for understanding proper epistemology to explore why it shouldn't be convincing and what specifically goes wrong with it. To begin with, of course, I want to just mention the fact that for specific gods, with specific doctrines that have made specific promises and have specific properties, and are part of scriptures that have made specific claims about reality, it is entirely possible to disprove those kinds of gods. For instance, it's quite easy to prove that the Christian God exists merely because of all the contradictions in his nature that we see throughout the Bible, and the claims that he makes about reality in the Bible, either as quoted by those who wrote the scriptures or through the people who wrote the scriptures, those claims being wrong when he should be omniscient. And it's also possible to bring in arguments such as the argument from divine hiddenness and the problem of evil and so on, which I will discuss near the end of this video. But when talking more about sort of an abstract deistic God, which is what theists seem to prefer talking about even if they are religious, specifically because it is much harder to substantiate a specific religion, since you somehow have to connect the abstract need for some kind of prime mover to a specific set of often very historically situated and very idiosyncratic doctrines, which is already an indication of the theist's position. But yeah, so when speaking about sort of a very abstract, almost theistic God, it is in fact true that there is no evidence that we could provide that would disprove the existence of such a God, barring the arguments that I'm going to make near the end of this video, which I'm not sure work. So I don't want to rely on them too heavily here. So let's assume that those don't exist. So it's a lot like Russell's teapot, where you can, if you say that there's a teapot in the orbit between Earth and Mars somewhere, if whatever someone does to go check that the teapot is there, you could simply change the properties of the teapot such that whatever tests they did would not be sufficient to find the teapot. So, for instance, if they searched every inch of space visually, around Mars, with some kind of huge magnifying glass or something, you could say, well, the teapot's invisible. And if they physically searched all of the space around Mars somehow, you could say, well, either the teapot's further out or it's also immaterial, and so on and so forth, right? If you had just a magic teapot detector that could detect any kind of teapot, no matter what its properties, you could simply say that, the teapot was moving around such that the teapot detector, was never close enough to actually, detect the teapot, right? And just like that, you can manipulate the properties of a deistic God as much as you want in order to make any kind of disproof impossible. Now, of course, in the arguments that I'm going to give, I can basically, what you can do is you can force the theist to move the properties of their God so much to evade your disproofs that it becomes something that's not worth calling a God at all. But we'll talk about that later. The real response to this point, that you can't prove that God does not exist, is that this point is often used to place the religious person on the same footing or on level ground with an atheist. Basically saying, yeah, I have no proof, but you don't have any proof that I can't be right. The problem with this is that it still doesn't place them on even footing. If you believe in something for which there is no evidence, and depending on how you define its properties, for which there could be no evidence, you are not on the same footing as someone who withholds belief until there is enough evidence. Um, that's just not how proper epistemology works. It's like saying, well, I believe in aliens because you can't prove that aliens don't exist. Or, I believe in Bigfoot because you can't prove that Bigfoot doesn't exist. Or, I believe in the pink unicorn that lives, in the center of the earth because you can't prove that it doesn't exist, right? The only possible response, right, this is just not how belief works for any other set of beliefs. And in fact, believing something on no evidence, unless you're going to be inconsistent, means that you should believe anything that's proposed to you on whether or not there is evidence. In fact, if no evidence is enough evidence to get you to believe something, then logically speaking, you should believe every possible proposition, whether there's evidence for it or not, even contradictory ones. Which of course means that the position that accepting a belief on the basis of no evidence, that it renders that position contradictory in itself. Which is a reductio that demonstrates exactly how much of an incorrect epistemology that is. Of course, a religious person could say that they select beliefs based on their effects, not whether there is evidence for them. But of course, I've dealt with this sort of argument in several of my previous videos. So go watch one of those based on the specific version of the appeal to consequences with regards to religion that you are facing or that you believe if you're a theist. But let's real quick go into the arguments against God. So again, none of these arguments can conclusively prove that no form of something which we might call a God exists. The purpose of these arguments is to show how certain gods with certain properties cannot exist. And if I demonstrate that enough of these properties and the right properties in a god are impossible, then that will force the kind of God that remains possible to have to lack enough properties that it will no longer be worth calling a god, even though you could arbitrarily define it as a god if you desired. So the first argument I want to talk about, obviously, is the problem of evil. This is obviously one that is familiar to almost any theist, but I think that there aren't really any good objections to it, and so I want to go through the objections that are commonly given in order to slap them down, essentially. But first, let me give the basic argument. The basic argument goes like this. If you have an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God, then you have got a God that has the desire, the knowledge, the desire and ability to remove any evil that it finds from existence, and the knowledge to find all evil in existence. Therefore, a God that has all three properties should have the desire and the full capacity to create a reality in which there is no evil. Yet, we see evil in reality. Therefore, if a God does exist, it must be missing one of these properties. Either it is not able to eliminate evil, or it is not willing, or it does not know about some evil. Obviously, I should reiterate again, this does not disprove the existence of God, but it certainly disproves a God that has all three of the omnis. Now, let's go into some common theistic responses to this. The first response, and the least satisfying, is the free will response. Basically, theists argue that if God were to create a reality in which evil were not possible, then that would be a reality in which we'd all have to be automatons that had no choice but to do good things. And of course, free will is a moral good that outweighs all of the moral evil that is caused by it existing. There are several responses to this. The short and pithy response is to point out that heaven is a place that is both all good and in which free will presumably still exists. And so God is clearly capable of creating a reality in which there is free will and no evil. The Another response is to point out that it would be possible to give people total moral free will and simply make it physically impossible for them to act on their desires. It could even be possible for them to attempt to do so and just make it so that they always fail. For instance, there could be a sort of force field around everyone that means that no one can be hurt by anyone else. And, you can make it so people don't need food or anything, so they can't be starved or, starved to death, and so on and so forth. People could still try to attack others. It just simply wouldn't work. There could also be a universally effective police force that simply prevents beforehand anyone attempting to act out on violent, or evil thoughts. Another option would be that God could simply manipulate chance. So although it was theoretically physically possible for evil to happen, it simply by chance never happened, even if people willed it. If someone tried to stab you, it just so happened that they would miss every time, and so on. There are many logically possible ways in which the effects of evil could be removed without removing free will, even leaving aside the example of heaven, which we don't really know how it works. There's also the point to be made that even if humans had free will and free reign to commit as much evil as they wanted, there's no reason that God would have to allow natural disasters to cause suffering. Because natural disasters don't need free will, right? So that objection is simply silly. Also, God could just simply make it so that although it would be theoretically possible for us to choose evil, we just never happen to desire to, and so on and so on and so on. Another theistic response to the problem of evil is that since morality is impossible without religion, which I've dealt with in previous videos and is untrue, but let's just assume that they are correct. Since morality is impossible without religion, we are assuming we're assuming the Christian religion in order to critique the Christian religion, and that we're taking evil, a concept which can only exist in religion, and using it to critique religion. The proper response to this, of course, is that even if we replace the word evil with suffering, which we know can exist even in a natural world, it still causes the same problem, because an all-loving, i.e. omnibenevolent, God would not desire suffering to happen to his creation any more than he would desire evil. Additionally, another response, and the most important one, even more than the previous one, is to point out that this is the whole point. We are trying to expose a contradiction within theistic morality, at least in the monotheistic religions, or doctrine, not morality. And so, of course, we're assuming the religious idea of evil, if we even are, but assuming that we are, because we are trying to show how the religious doctrines contradict themselves. So we're taking as premises and as definitions only things within the religion, and then showing how they internally conflict. So of course it's no surprise that if we even are depending on religious definitions, that we are doing so, because we're trying to show an internal contradiction. And what you do to show an internal contradiction is assume the premises of a belief and then show that leads to a problem. So another theistic response to the problem of evil is to say that, well, God works in mysterious ways. There could be a plan that he has that requires some suffering or evil now that will cause even greater moral good later on. And people will sometimes use examples such as, a parent taking their child to the dentist, and so on and so forth. The problem with this, of course, is that God is omniscient. God should not need to use any methods that he does not want to use in order to achieve his goals. Therefore, if God is using evil, it's not because he has to use evil to achieve the desired end. He could simply snap his fingers and achieve whatever end he wants. That's the definition of omniscience. omnipotence. Sorry. The only reason that God could be using evil is because he wants evil to exist and wants to use it. That it's, part of the outcome he desires in some way, which makes him not omnibenevolent. Now, the final theistic response to this is simply to admit that God is not omnibenevolent. Paul says in one of his letters, I forget which, that there are vessels made for wrath and vessels made for love, or something along those lines. They could also point out that, the entire point of God's plan is to demonstrate his mercy in order to get people to worship them. The problem with the first example is that, that's not a God that's worth worshiping. And the problem with the second example is that that too is not a God that's worth worshiping. Because if you hurt someone and abuse them, in order that they can appreciate you being nice to them later on, that's evil. That's or at least, if you believe that it's impossible to say something is evil if you're an atheist, that's still sadistic, and therefore not worth worshiping. So that takes omnibenevolence out of the picture, or at least it takes one of the properties. Usually Christians desire first to deny omnibenevolence than any of the other properties. So let's take the problem of evil as removing omnibenevolence. Then we get to the argument from divine hiddenness, which basically points out that it is inconsistent for there to be a God that desires all creatures to know that it exists so that they either can have a personal relationship with it, or have no excuse for rejecting it, which describes the God in the Christian Bible, at least. It's contradictory for there to be a God that has that desire, but also has omniscience and omnipotence, but does not make its existence perfectly clear to each individual person. You see, basically, as long as there is one genuine non-believer, then a God that has omniscience and omnipotence and also desires to demonstrate its existence to every person for the reasons stated above, it is impossible for such a God to exist. Because basically, if it has omniscience and omnipotence, then it knows exactly what would convince every single member of the human race, and obviously it has a desire to do so. So why hasn't it, right? And Christians will try to respond by saying that God doesn't bother demonstrating its existence to everyone because not everyone will believe on a normal amount of evidence, right? But God can personalize evidence to every single person and knows exactly what would convince them. So it's not like we're asking for the God to make it evident, just in nature to everyone at the same standard of evidence. Like, people may have higher standards of evidence, but God would know how to satisfy them. They could also say that, there are no genuine non-believers. Basically, we've all hardened our hearts, and so God has actually made its presence known to everyone. Of course, I can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that that's not the case to a theist that's convinced that this is the case. But the only thing that I can know for sure are the contents of my own mind. And I know what those contents are. I know that I'm a genuine non-believer. And you can see that there are many people that would rather believe in a God but simply don't find themselves convinced. And so unless you're willing to believe that every single person that says stuff like that is lying, then this argument holds. So this means that this definitely proves that the Christian God does not exist, because the Christian God claims to have made its existence apparent to everyone, and definitely has the desire to make its existence apparent to everyone. And it yeah. So it also eliminates a omnibenevolent God, because let's modify the argument a little bit. If a God is going to punish those who do not believe, but it wants the best for everyone, then it would want as many people as possible to believe. So as long as there's someone who would believe if given enough evidence, but who does not currently believe, then an omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent God cannot exist, because that God would know exactly what would be needed and be able to carry it out to convince that person. Moving on. Now let's talk about the properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence themselves. We've already talked. Omnibenevolence is not particularly interesting because it is logically possible to, love everyone. However, omniscience is a bit of a problem, because if it's impossible to verify that you know everything. You could be made to think you know everything, right? And how would you verify if you didn't, right? Like, that's not quite right. The point I'm trying to make is that, there could be things that God thinks he knows but actually doesn't know, that are simply not testable by God. And so there would be no way to know whether one is truly omniscient or not. And therefore you can't be omniscient, because in order to be omniscient, you'd have to know for sure whether you are omniscient. Otherwise, there's something that you don't know, which means that you don't know everything. And once you say that, well, you know everything except whether you actually are omniscient, that opens the door to the possibility that the thing that thinks it's omniscient actually isn't. As well as the point that specifically in relation to the Christian God, there are several passages which claim that God has eyes everywhere and so on. But then there are also many passages where God clearly doesn't know things and has to ask people or send people to scout. There are also cases where God has to test people, which wouldn't be necessary if he, was omniscient, because he would know beforehand what the outcome would be. There are also cases where God has to be bargained with, which doesn't make sense if God would know what the outcome of the bargain was. So the Christian God in particular here is in a sticky situation with regard to omniscience, and is essentially internally contradictory. Now, let's talk about omnipotence. There's a reason that most sophisticated theists, among them, I believe, Dr. William Lane Craig, don't say omnipotent anymore. They say sufficiently powerful, or maximally powerful, or extremely powerful. And the reason that is because omnipotence means having the ability to produce logical contradictions. But if that's possible, then you can produce logical contradictions, such as a rock so heavy God can't lift it, that negate omnipotence. But of course, if you say that something can only do what's logical, if you say God can only do what's logical, that throws a wrench into many other apologetics, and there are other problems with that, but I can't remember them at the moment. So, I think actually that's all I wanted to really cover in this video.